Hello everyone, and welcome to the OU School of Community Medicine Summer Institute. I'm Shawn Schaefer, Director of the OU Urban Design Studio. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I hope you enjoy my anchoring lecture entitled Envisioning a Healthy Community. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." I've expanded his concept to include not just buildings, but the streets, squares, parks, and all of the elements of the built environment that make up our cities, so that we may say, we shape our environments, thereafter they shape us. My talk today is a riff on this quote, where I will pose and attempt to answer three questions. What kind of city have we shaped? How is our city shaping us? And how do we envision a healthy community? To answer the first question, what kind of city have we shaped? I will be looking at the 3 Ds of density, diversity, and design. For our analysis today, we're going to be looking at the city of Tulsa. Before delving into the 3 Ds, I would like to spend some time getting you oriented and giving you some background on how the city developed. To do this, we will be looking at a series of maps created at the Urban Design Studio using our Geographic Information System. All of these maps are oriented with north at the top of the page. They are about 30 miles wide and 30 miles high. The red line you see are the current city limits of the city of Tulsa. The extent of Tulsa County is shown in the yellow shade. It's worth noting that portions of the city of Tulsa lie outside of Tulsa County. This area to the northwest is in Osage County, formerly the Osage Indian Reservation. This panhandle in the east is in Wagner County. Now, this first map shows us the natural features of the region. It essentially shows what was here before development, before the city was founded. The main natural feature of the region is the Arkansas River Valley. You can see the Arkansas River enters the map from the west, makes a bend, and then exits to the southeast. Even though the Arkansas River has extensive flood control measures, it still has a substantial floodplain associated with it. There is also a large floodplain on the north side of town, associated with Bird Creek and its main tributary, Mingo Creek. Mingo Creek runs from south to north on the east side of town and has an extensive history of flooding. We have also mapped the region's topography, with areas shown in brown representing slopes greater than 20%. These areas are impediments to development because it is difficult to install streets, infrastructure, and building foundations. You can see that areas west of the Arkansas River and in Osage County have a folded topography. These are flat-topped hills called cuestas, sometimes called the Osage Hills. They are part of the sandstone and shale formation which comes down from Coffeyville, Kansas. Areas to the east of the river are much flatter and more suitable for development, the exception being these small hills in the southern portion of the city known as Tulsa Hills or Southern Hills. Most of the land area of the city started out as pasture and grasslands, except for the hilly areas which are part of the Cross Timbers region, a wooded ecosystem combining species from eastern and western forests. Now I would like to show you a time series illustrating Tulsa's development from its early days until present time. For each of these maps, I would like you to focus on 2 interconnected elements. The first being the extent of the urbanized area, showing here in this brown shade, and the second being the major transportation system being used at that time. This first map from 1920 shows how Tulsa grew up along the eastern bank of the Arkansas River. It was no accident that Tulsa was founded here. At this bend, the water shallows and cattle could be forded. It was also the location for Tulsa's first bridges. Tulsa is very much a railroad city. As you can see, many rail lines coming in from the east and west sides of town. You can also see some of the smaller communities like Owasso, Catoosa, Broken Arrow, Jenks, and just barely on the map, Sapulpa. They are all about 15 miles from downtown Tulsa. This is also no coincidence because locomotives would have to stop and take on water in those days, and 15 miles was about the interval they could go before running out of steam. Now, Tulsa was not only dependent on railroads for inner-city travel, but it also relied on rail for local travel within the city. You can see from these photos from the early 1900s that Tulsa had an extensive streetcar network, in place even before the roads were paved. Rail transit like this requires a certain amount of density to be efficient. You can see that the urbanized area of the city at this point was a compact 10 square miles. Let's zoom in and take a closer look at the development pattern of early Tulsa. This map shows the downtown area. It is a modern map with the ring of highways known as the interdispersal loop. But inside this enclosure, you can still see the grid of streets and blocks platted by the railroad engineers. Notice how the grid is rotated away from the cardinal directions and aligned to the railroad tracks? The engineers chose the path for the tracks first to allow for the least amount of grade change, since locomotives have difficulty climbing hills. The grid is then laid out parallel and perpendicular to the tracks to avoid awkward crossings. The engineers wanted an easy way to divide the land for lot draws to attract settlers and then use a uniform layout of relatively small 2-acre square blocks 300 feet on each side. This creates a high degree of connectivity with 186 intersections in the downtown area, over half of which have traffic signals. Many people do not realize that almost a third of the traffic signals in Tulsa are in downtown. Jumping forward 30 years to 1950 highlights the explosive growth of the city, with the urbanized area almost quadrupling. For the most part, the growth was concentric around downtown, with the exceptions being the area west of the river and the area northwest in Osage County. The difficult terrain mentioned earlier partially accounts for this. The west bank of the river was also the home of heavy industry, oil refineries, and train yards, which is another contributing factor. The land ownership issues on the Indian Reservation in Osage County are another. Meanwhile, the major transportation development during this period is the adoption of the motor car as a primary means of getting around. This is apparent in the grid of streets appearing on the map. These streets follow the early section roads platted using the Uniform Land Measurement System when land was allotted to settlers. These 1-mile squares align with the cardinal directions and facilitated the division of land with simplified legal descriptions. Settlers needed access to their plats, and it was only natural that the roads followed the section dividing lines, eventually becoming Tulsa's primary arterial street network. Let's look at a close-up of an area developed during this period. This map shows one of Tulsa's first suburban areas, Cherry Street. You can clearly see the section streets along the perimeter of the map. Peoria Avenue on the west, 11th Street on the north, Lewis Avenue on the east, and 21st Street on the south. Two minor arterials bisect the area, with Utica Avenue running south to north, and Cherry Street or 15th Street running east-west. Unlike downtown with its uniform grid, this area was platted using a series of overlapping grids platted by land speculators like Mr. Orcutt, the developer of what we now refer to as Swan Lake. Some of the blocks run north-south, and some are oriented east-west. The block size is still relatively small, with a mean of 3.3 acres, which again provides fairly high connectivity, here with 157 street intersections. However, traffic is starting to be directed onto the hierarchy of arterial streets, with far fewer signalized intersections, only 15 occurring at the major crossroads. Leaping ahead another 30 years brings us to 1980, a period of rapid suburban growth, with the urbanized area almost quadrupling again to over 144 square miles. Transportation-induced growth was a major factor in this period due to the construction of new expressways. The first two being the Skelly Bypass, now Interstate 44, and the Broken Arrow Expressway. You can clearly see the trend for development to the southeast along these routes. The growth of the city of Broken Arrow is also noteworthy. Highways built later, including US 169 on the east side of town and US Highway 75, have yet to reveal their effect. Looking at the development pattern during this time reveals a new street and block pattern. This map represents a typical example of what we at the Urban Design Studio call the Miracle Mile phenomena. It is shown at the same scale as the previous downtown and Cherry Street maps for comparison. The now familiar arterial streets in this example are Harvard Avenue on the west, 51st Street on the north, Yale Avenue on the east, and 61st Street on the south. The pattern inside the area is distinctive, with large irregular blocks nearly 10 acres in size, with a curved dendritic street pattern. There are few collector streets and many cul-de-sacs. Consequently, connectivity is seriously reduced to only 126 street intersections. Examining more recent land cover data indicates ex-urban growth continuing, with the addition of another 70 square miles of urban area largely in outlying suburbs, particularly around the newest expressway in the region, the Creek Turnpike, shown here in brown. The Creek Turnpike only crosses the southern tip of the city of Tulsa, so city fathers annexed this eastern panhandle of the city to try to capture new growth around the highway. Here you can see a composite of the previous maps showing Tulsa's evolution thus far. We will refer back to it as we begin our analysis of the 3 Ds, starting with density. You can see from the previous map that Tulsa's urbanized area has multiplied over 23 times since 1920. The population of the urban area has also increased from 127,000 people to over 630,000 people today. Normalizing this data, however, shows that the rate of population growth has not kept pace with the increase in land area. Hence, population density has nosedived from 12,700 persons per square mile to fewer than 2,800 persons per square mile, which means a family of 4 now occupies over an acre of urban land. We have truly realized Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of a broad-acre city. Let's take a closer look at density by examining some census tract data. This map shows Tulsa's population density in 1960. You can see the compact and relatively dense settlement pattern that existed at the time. The central city, which I refer to as the Golden Rectangle, was home to 28% of the county's population, with close to 100,000 residents. It had an average density of nearly 10,000 persons per square mile. In contrast, Broken Arrow was a small town of 7,800 people separated from Tulsa by 10 miles of farms and ranch land. If we jump ahead to 2010, you see a much different pattern with a larger footprint and diffuse distribution. The Golden Rectangle has lost close to half its population and is today home to only 9% of the county's total. It is difficult to find census tracts with a density of even 5,000 persons per square mile. Broken Arrow has exploded in size to a city of over 100,000 inhabitants. Likewise, areas of South and East Tulsa that were rural now have a significant suburban population. In fact, Broken Arrow and Tulsa have essentially merged with no apparent boundary. One does not notice when leaving one and entering the other unless you happen to notice that Tulsa uses green street signs and Broken Arrow uses blue ones. We can get an even finer grain look at Tulsa's population density by zooming down to the census block level. The first thing that really pops out is this hole in the middle of the donut. Downtown Tulsa has very few blocks with residents, and in this regard is a weak center. The last census count had 3,500 residents in downtown, with close to 1,500 of those living in the far northwest block, which contains the county jail. The centers of the suburban towns like Owasso and Broken Arrow are even weaker and difficult to locate. Should be noted, however, that there are many new housing units under construction downtown, and the suburban communities are starting to take notice of their historic centers, so this map may start to change in the coming years. Lastly, it can be difficult to visualize density without some context. This graph shows Tulsa's density in relation to other cities. It's no great surprise that Tulsa has about the same density as Houston. It might be a little bit more surprising to see that Los Angeles has twice our density. Of course, New York and European cities are 4 to 8 times as dense, and when you get to Asia, well, things get really out of hand. In fact, it's difficult to find any major cities with lower density than us, but Atlanta has the distinction of even more sprawl, at 1,500 persons per square mile. So, we can begin to answer our first question: what kind of city have we shaped? It's a low-density environment with diffuse boundaries and weak centers. Let's move on now to the second D, diversity. Here is our composite map to refresh your memory. Keep that in mind as we break down the urbanized area to look at the diversity of types of land use. This first land use map shows remote sensing data from the Landsat Thematic Mapper. It is essentially an infrared heat map of the region with the different colors representing various levels of impervious surface, a proxy for the intensity of development. The highest intensity development is shown here in red. You can clearly see downtown Tulsa, as well as a large warehouse district at the intersection of Broken Arrow Expressway and Interstate 44. If you look closely, you can even make out the highways and streets themselves. Orange and yellow areas are lower intensity development, like housing subdivisions. Note what I call the Midtown trend. Before I started doing this type of mapping, if you asked me where Midtown Tulsa was located, I could probably only give you a vague idea. But here you can actually see it as visible from space as a lower intensity development pattern. It barely touches the river, and it extends much further south than most people think, especially if you're willing to jump over the barrier of the highway. Remember this feature, as it will show up again in future maps. Now let's take a look at Tulsa's zoning map, which allows us to look not just at intensity, but at designated land use as well. Notice how it closely matches the previous map. The zoning map helps us decipher the historic land use patterns. The first thing to note is that downtown has its own designation as the central business district. This is because downtown was developed before zoning was invented, and to this day has very little in the way of restrictions. Mixed uses are permitted, there are no setbacks, and no parking requirements. Radiating from downtown, you can see fingers of closely related but separated uses in different colors. The red ones represent commercial streets, like 11th Street, also known as Old Route 66. Older neighborhoods near downtown tend to be orange-colored, since apartment buildings were often mixed with single-family residences. Purple industrial tracts follow the railroads. You can also see larger industrial zones on the west bank of the river near the refineries, surrounding the international airport, and covering that warehouse district that I mentioned earlier. South and east of Interstate 44, a new pattern emerges with commercial nodes at major street intersections, sometimes surrounded by a multifamily buffer, and then yellow single-family subdivisions occupying most of the land in the center of each section. This pattern is the result of the LUIS, or Land Use Intensification System, adopted by modernist planners in the 1960s. You can clearly see that Broken Arrow followed Tulsa's lead in adopting this practice of segregating its land uses. Another way to examine the city's diversity is to look at the demographics of the population. This map shows the percentage of minority population at the census block level. You can see that Tulsa's minority population is highly segregated. The triangle of Tulsa North has some blocks with more than 90% minority population. Notice the opposite is true for the Midtown trend. We can break this down further and see that Tulsa North is predominantly the home of our African American community. Another important minority group, Tulsa Hispanic population, grew rapidly in the 1990s and early 2000s. While more diffuse, you can see a settlement pattern emerge for this group as well. It forms an inverted L shape centered along Interstate 244 and U.S. Highway 169. These areas have a large supply of affordable housing, and in the case of the former, had experienced significant population loss before the arrival of the immigrants. Another population demographic of interest is median age. Here we can see the median age in Tulsa County is around 34 years, but like ethnicity and race, the distribution is far from equally distributed. The Midtown trend is prominent again here, with median ages 10 to 20 years older than the county. Conversely, the L-shaped area associated with the Hispanic population is much younger. The residential university campuses, TU and ORU, are also bright green. These age differences have an impact on household size, which subsequently has an effect on the public school enrollment. The Tulsa Public School District has seen a decline of 1/3 of its enrollment in 30 years, while minority enrollment has gone from 20% to 65%. The last demographic I would like to take a look at is household income. Starting with another time series, we see household income as a percentage of the county's median income in 1980. The county's median income then was around $17,000 per household, or $45,000 in 2010 dollars. Census tracts in the Midtown trend and South Tulsa are considerably above median income, while downtown, Tulsa North, and the surrounding rural areas are much poorer, some even less than half the county median. By the year 2000, the higher income areas begin to move further south, while East Tulsa drops below the median. Tulsa North's low income disparity becomes even more concentrated. In 2009, higher income areas are seen migrating out of Tulsa altogether to the suburban communities of Jenks, Broken Arrow, and Owasso. It's interesting to note that after the financial collapse of 2008, the county's median household income returned to the same level seen in 1980. At the risk of getting too technical, it's worth spending a moment discussing the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient measures the extent of income inequality of a population. Populations of different sizes can be compared using the Gini coefficient because it parameterizes the distributions. A population with a coefficient of 1 has perfect equality with every person in the population receiving the same income. A population with a coefficient of 100 has the opposite effect, with very few people receiving all the income. Of course, these two extremes are hypothetical. Real populations all fall somewhere in between. For instance, the Scandinavian countries have the lowest known Gini coefficients, scoring in the low 20s. The European Union as a whole averages 31. Canada is also close to this average. It is quite a jump to the U.S. value of 46.9. Tulsa County is higher still at 48.2. Essentially the same distribution as Mexico. Of course, the income levels here are higher than in Mexico, but we spread the money around in the same fashion. The city of Tulsa comes in at 51.9, on par with many developing countries. Why should we care about all this? I suggest we should care because the CIA tracks this statistic closely, as it correlates well with the rates of civil unrest. Our high numbers are not a good vital sign. Now let's move on to the third D, design. Design is a huge topic with many facets which we could never cover in one lecture, but I want to focus on one specific area of design, namely the design of our transportation systems, since it has such a profound effect on almost all aspects of city design and the quality of life for city dwellers. To begin with, let's examine the design of our street networks. Here you can see on the left a typical neighborhood platted in the 1920s and 30s, Florence Park. Imagine you are an 8-year-old child that lives in one of the homes with a red dot, and your best friend lives at the other dot. Florence Park's street network is a regular orthogonal grid with rectangular blocks and many intersections. With such a layout, the path from your house to your friends would be fairly direct, requiring perhaps a turn or two. You would also not be required to venture out to the main arterial street to make the trip. For contrast, let's compare Florence Park to a typical neighborhood platted in the 1990s in South Tulsa. The red dots are about the same distance apart, but the street network is hierarchical or dendritic, with main collectors and dead-end cul-de-sacs. The same trip in this neighborhood would be much less direct, unless you like to hop fences and tame pit bulls. The trip is also much longer and requires you to walk along the busy arterial street. I'm not sure my mother would let me make this trip on my own, and I would either not be able to go or she would have to drive me. Speaking of arterial streets, let's turn our attention to their design. Here are two examples, the older Utica Avenue on the right and the newer 71st Street on the left. Both have wide cartways with many lanes which make them difficult for pedestrians to cross. Traffic signals occur every mile or so, and you have to walk a long way for a protected crossing. It's either that or play Frogger with the 45-mile-an-hour traffic. The wide cartways and large building setbacks create an undefined urban space, causing businesses to erect large signs to try to capture the motorist's attention. Sidewalks abut the street edge and often have obstructions like utility poles blocking the path. Adding insult to injury, the many wide lanes are not always needed, and almost all of our streets are far under their design capacity. During the recent update of Tulsa's comprehensive plan, transportation engineers from Kimley Horn Associates did a volume-to-capacity analysis of Tulsa's street and highway system. The results are shown on this map, with areas of low congestion shown in green and medium and higher congestion in yellow and red respectively. Isolating streets with low traffic counts, generally below 20,000 vehicles per day, shows almost no congestion, particularly on the east-west arterials where good crosstown highway connections exist. Congestion on high-volume streets is also limited, with the heavy traffic mainly occurring on the Broken Arrow Expressway and U.S. Highway 169. In fact, 89% of the lane miles in the region had little or no congestion. Why would this not be good news? Well, it means we are overbuilding our infrastructure for negligible improvements in travel time. Tulsa already has one of the lowest commute times in the nation, but we are building streets we cannot maintain with the tax revenues generated by the region they serve. Finally, no discussion of the design of Tulsa's transport infrastructure would be complete without touching on the public transportation system. The route map here illustrates what I would euphemistically call a hybrid system. It is primarily a cross between a hub system and a grid system with a few loops thrown in for good measure. The main hub is the downtown transfer station, where almost all routes eventually stop. As the routes leave downtown, they tend to spread out by following the arterial street grid. Few routes, like the 222 Superloop, shown in green, make a long circuit. This route serves the OU-Tulsa campus and is a great way to see a big swath of Tulsa if you have a few hours to kill. The average headway between buses for these routes is close to an hour, and that is during weekdays. There is little nighttime or weekend surface. Tulsa averages about 2.7 million riders a year. This may sound like a large number, but it pales in comparison to some of our peers. Albuquerque, another car-dominated city, has 4 times the ridership we do. Charlotte has 8 times, and Salt Lake City has an astounding 14 times the ridership. Mind you, these are our peers, not big cities with extensive mass transit like New York and Chicago. With limited public transportation and streets over-designed for cars, it really is not any surprise that travel in Tulsa is overwhelmingly by automobile. This assertion is easily backed up with reams of data such as this breakdown of commuting mode share showing more than 95% of commuting done in cars, over 80% in single-occupant vehicles. I bet you thought I would never get to the end of the answer for this question, but we can put a period on it now. What kind of city have we shaped? It's a low-density environment with diffuse boundaries, weak centers, segregated populations, and isolated land uses, designed for automobiles as the only means of transport. So if that is the kind of city we have shaped, let's turn to our second question. How is this city shaping us? Since the primary audience for this talk is a group of medical professionals, I've chosen to address this question from a public health perspective. I do this with a little trepidation since I'm not a healthcare professional myself, so bear with me. I think if you mention public health and environmental issues in the same breath, what comes to mind for many people are actually the issues of a century ago, namely sanitation and hygiene, overcrowding, and infectious diseases. Now, I do not mean to suggest that these issues have gone away. They require our constant vigilance, but we largely have the knowledge and means to deal with them, especially in the developed world. What I am interested in are some of the public health issues that have emerged during the latter part of the last century and the first part of the new one. Issues like environmental quality, motor vehicle accidents, chronic diseases, and the obesity epidemic. I would like to spend a few minutes briefly reviewing what the research says about the connection between these issues and the design of the built environment. To begin, let's look at air quality, since it's perhaps the least controversial with a long history of study and a well-established causal chain. Here you can see that sprawling urban form influences travel behavior by increasing the number of vehicle miles and vehicle hours traveled, which subsequently impacts air quality by increasing the amount of particulate matter, ozone, and a variety of dangerous compounds released into the air we breathe. The air pollution affects health outcomes, particularly by increasing respiratory diseases like asthma, as well as cardiovascular disease and cancer. Many people in Tulsa believe that the oil refineries are our biggest source of air pollution, but in fact, mobile sources, cars and trucks, as well as small motors from appliances and lawnmowers are the worst contributors. Our weather patterns leave us particularly predisposed to high ozone levels, and we are always near the non-attainment level set by the EPA. I think only the questionable efforts of our congressional delegation have kept us off the dirty air list so far. Car crashes may be the most significant public health issue we routinely ignore. If there's one thing I can practically guarantee you is that as health professionals, you will all see patients that have been involved in motor vehicle accidents. Tulsa County, for instance, experiences around 8,000 crashes a year that result in injury where the victims lose time from work or school. 50 to 60 people die every year, about the same number that die from homicide in the city. The research is more convoluted for this issue. As we've discussed, urban form and street design are closely linked. Spread out, segregated uses require more car trips, often on high-speed streets and highways. High traffic speeds lead to more crashes, with the likelihood of injury and fatality increasing exponentially at speeds above 30 miles per hour. Increased traffic volume can also lead to more wrecks, but there is an ameliorating effect from congestion, which can reduce traffic speeds. Just one of congestion's surprising benefits. Also, dendritic street networks outperform better connected grids since they reduce the number of intersections and points of conflict. Next is a hot topic, the obesity epidemic. In Oklahoma, only about a third of the population has a body mass index in the normal range. One of the culprits seems to be a lack of physical activity, leading to increased health risks including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and osteoporosis. What is less clear is how the design of our environment is contributing to our activity levels. Two separate groups of researchers have come to conflicting conclusions. Researchers that study active transportation, that is walking and biking for a purpose, conclude that high-density, mixed-use environments with well-connected street networks and transit lead to higher activity levels and lower obesity rates. On the other hand, researchers that study recreation give the edge to the suburbs, with more opportunities for sports and activities. There are a number of ongoing studies hoping to reconcile these accounts. I suspect that it does not have to be an either-or proposition, and that we do not have to give up recreation opportunities in order to create walkable environments conducive to active transportation. Another well-researched area is in the realm of social capital. Social capital comes in two flavors. Bonding social capital increases citizens' sense of belonging, while bridging social capital allows them to create connections and build trust. High levels of both result in lower mortality rates and improved physical and mental health. The amount of time spent driving reduces the time spent building social capital and can have the opposite effect. With close to a third of Oklahomans suffering from mental illness in a given year, it's hard to believe that there is not an environmental component. Surprisingly, little is known about the effect of urban form on mental health. This is an area where young researchers might build a research agenda. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that not all members of society are affected equally by these issues. Women drive more than men, spending more than an hour a day behind the wheel, putting them at greater risk for accidents, air pollution, and stress. They often spend their time transporting children and elders who are among the 1/3 of the population that cannot drive due to age or infirmity. The poor and disabled are other groups that face transportation barriers that reduce their access to healthy food, recreational activities, and health care. So, how is our city shaping us? Low-density, segregated-use environments designed around automobiles lower air quality, lead to more car crashes, reduce social capital, and may contribute to decreased physical activity, chronic health risks, and poor mental health. If these health outcomes can be improved by changing the design of our city, what can we do to envision a healthy community? I would suggest we need an evidence-based urban design rooted in the emerging science of human settlements. A truly transdisciplinary endeavor involving not just public health, but ecology, climatology, social justice, urban economics, transportation engineering, and a host of other subjects. If our low-density segregated uses and automobile dependence are negatively impacting our health, not to mention that they are energy inefficient, socially unjust, and fiscally wasteful, then it would seem the simple solution would be to move to compact, mixed-use development with many modes of transportation choices. But before we can make this paradigm shift, we need to understand the values and principles at the root of our current civilization and what brought us to this point. We need to make what Otto Scharmer in his book Theory U calls the deep dive. Up until this point, I've tried to rely on evidence and remain as objective as possible, but I am a professor after all, and at this point I'm going to offer my theory. I believe that civilization, and here I'm going to make the qualification that I'm primarily talking about Western civilization, has gone through two main paradigms and is possibly entering a third. I call these three the theistic, the anthropomorphic, and the ecological models. When civilization emerged about 6,000 years ago, resources were rare and difficult to obtain, nature was not well understood, and outside forces dominated the human world. People created stories and myths to explain what was happening, and knowledge was often gained through divine contact. As cities became more successful and produced surpluses, educated classes emerged, priests and rulers that had a special relationship with the divine and derived power from their specialized knowledge. The primary energy source during this period was photosynthesis from live plants, crops grown for food, feed for livestock to perform work and provide transport, and wood or dung burned for fuel. This paradigm started to be challenged with the arrival of classical thought during ancient Greece and Rome, but really did not give way until the Renaissance and the advent of scientific thought. New ideas ushered in an anthropomorphic civilization. Copernicus and modern astronomy revealed Earth did not have a divine position at the center of the universe. Newton explained physics using mechanistic models and showed how humans could manipulate nature. Columbus proved the world was not flat and opened a new world of discovery that challenged the view that resources were limited. A new paradigm took hold, that man was separate from nature. Knowledge was gained from experimentation and breaking things down into systems and constituent parts. New educated classes emerged, including scholars and professionals. Eventually, these ideas would lead to an industrial revolution and an explosion of cities. The primary energy source during this period is photosynthesis from dead plants, in other words, fossil fuels. First coal, then petroleum and natural gas. I believe new ideas are driving another paradigm shift. The discoveries of Darwin have shown that humans are not the pinnacle of evolution, just another branch on nature's tree. The development of atomic bombs reminds us that with our new powers, there may be limits that we must respect. Photos from Apollo 8, like the one here on the right, give us a sense of the isolated closed system we are all a part of. We're beginning to realize that resources are finite, and we all belong to an interconnected ecosystem. Instead of breaking the world down to understand, we're beginning to perceive the cycles and the wholes. The educated classes in this new world will, by necessity, include almost everyone. The primary energy source is still to be determined, but it's likely to be technical photosynthesis, harnessing the sun's energy from radiation, wind, or biomass. As we come out of the deep dive, I'd like to spend a few minutes envisioning what a city based on ecological principles might be like. We're running out of time, so I will move quickly, just giving you a taste to increase your appetite to learn more. If you remember nothing else from this talk, focus on the interconnectedness of land use and transportation. If someone starts to discuss transportation, immediately look at land use implications, and vice versa. This always applies to the design of streets. We need to do a better job of designing our streets so that they serve all modes of travel, not just cars, but biking, walking, and transit. More importantly, they need to be designed for people, with opportunities for commerce and social interaction. Speaking of commerce, people are more and more interested in where their resources are coming from and how their products are produced. A good example of this is the local food movement that demands that healthy food be produced in a socially and environmentally responsible manner. Cities in the future will rely heavily on locally produced goods with lower transportation burden. No more 3,000-mile Caesar salads. Ask any ecologist, and they will tell you that the most robust ecosystems have a high amount of diversity. Our cities should too. We need to eliminate monocultures where all the buildings and uses are identical. Likewise, we need to replace turf lawns and asphalt parking lots with a wide range of plants and animals to reconnect us with nature. We need areas of mixed use where the preponderance of our daily needs are easily met. And social diversity is just as important so that everyone, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, lives in the same city with the same advantages. Our cities need to be a part of nature, and that means understanding and integrating urban systems into the natural cycles. As William McDonough put it, waste equals food. This can be done on the small scale with devices like composting toilets, or on a large scale with bio-waste digesters and waste-to-energy conversion plants. We will need to conserve everything and reduce our consumption. Contrast the typical suburban home on the lower right, its contents splayed across the front lawn, with the intentional community of Bedshead in England on the lower left, that strives to be a 0-0 neighborhood with zero outside inputs and zero waste. We also need to make the transition to utilizing renewable energy. This will include wind farms and hydroelectric dams from the industrial paradigm, but it will likely evolve to more urban solutions such as building integrated photovoltaics and smaller wind turbines. Imagine if every building and power pole in Tulsa could generate its own power. Another important principle borrowed from ecology is the idea of succession. All too often, we have taken the view that wilderness was a place to be tamed and harnessed for farming, logging, and mining. In turn, some of the farmed and logged areas were succeeded by development, increasingly sprawling urban and suburban areas. It's important to conserve the remaining wild areas we have left, as well as our valuable working lands. But perhaps most importantly, we must guard against the all too familiar last step of succession, abandonment. Instead of using up land and moving on to the next parcel, we need to clean up and redevelop brownfields and gray fields. Abandoned areas like the ones shown on the lower left in Detroit need to be re-inhabited or returned to some productive use. Closer to home, makes little sense for us to keep building new subdivisions in Owasso and Broken Arrow, while large areas of Tulsa North are closer to jobs, possess better views, and have established infrastructure with an abundance of underutilized land and buildings. We are also going to need to reimagine our suburbs to get better utilization of the tremendous amounts of land and energy they consume with little return on investment, and to make them more sustainable. This will mean higher densities and infill development. For centuries, cities have been designed on a 20-minute travel distance. Towns and urban districts for pedestrians are about 1 mile across. There's no reason to ignore the natural boundaries created by the human scale. Older cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen also respect a vertical human scale, namely 5 flights of stairs. Respecting human scale will make active transportation much more feasible, where most trips can be made on foot or bike. For longer trips to neighboring districts or regional destinations, quiet, clean transit like this streetcar in Portland make a lot of sense. We should also think about resiliency and question the wisdom of building in floodplains or other risky areas. Likewise, productive agricultural regions and sensitive environmental sites should be off limits for development. When we do develop, we should take care to not introduce unnecessary barriers like walls and fences. What kind of message do residents of gated enclaves like Stonewall Estates send to their neighbors? Lastly, we need to emulate natural systems by incorporating adequate feedback mechanisms. There are often externalities related to our behavior that exact a price on nature or society that we do not pay for because they are shifted to others or hidden in downstream costs. Nothing is more effective for changing behavior than directly imposing a cost to the consumer at the source. I think we might also want to think about the scale of the institutions we are creating and how their feedback mechanisms work. Larger organizations with more levels of management respond more slowly to change and cannot adapt to local conditions as well. Is a Walmart supercenter the right size for a general store? What about the size of the Texas Medical Center shown in the lower right? Yeah, that's right. That's all the Texas Medical Center, all of those buildings. Is this the model we want for our future healthcare environments? We need to utilize distributed decision-making as well, especially for our youth. We need to devise ways so they can independently navigate the environment, become confidently independent, and develop the skills needed for the next generation of civilization. So in summation, how do we envision a healthy community? Healthy communities are created using evidence-based urban design founded on the values and principles of an ecological civilization and the rigorous study of human settlement. Now, I've presented this in a linear fashion with a sort of inevitability to it all. But there is no guarantee that we will complete this paradigm shift. We may get stuck where we are. Or worse, we may regress or collapse altogether. Civilization's trajectory, after all, has not been a smooth and straight one. That is why it is important for all of us to participate in the change, even if it challenges our current beliefs and lifestyles. This is especially important for this audience. As educated professionals, you will be expected to champion healthy and equitable environments and lead by examples in your own practices. That is what we try to do at the Urban Design Studio. So I would like to close by sharing an example of our work. Every year, the students of the studio engage in a community-based urban design project. In 2011, we embarked on a plan for the Northland District. The district is located in Tulsa North, centered on the Northland Shopping Center, which you can see in this southeastward-looking aerial photograph near the center of the screen. The main street running past the center is 36th Street North. The Gilcrease Expressway runs parallel about a half-mile south, with Peoria Avenue running perpendicular near the top of the page. Our involvement stemmed from two precipitating events. At the time, I was serving on the city's Citizens Advisory Committee for Planet Tulsa, the city's new general comprehensive plan. Planet Tulsa had just been adopted that summer, and one of its main recommendations was that the city engage in small area plans. The small area plans are meant to fill in the local details that cannot possibly be addressed at the large scale of the comprehensive plan. Planet Tulsa clearly describes how to conduct these small area plans, but says little about who should undertake them or where they are needed. We decided that the studio would be ideally suited to start a small area plan as a pilot project, and the city planners agreed. Now we needed a district or corridor to focus on. Planet Tulsa made an emphatic point that the city should focus on Tulsa North, but that is still a large area. We needed to narrow it down further. Fortunately, the answer was right under our noses here at OU-Tulsa. The School of Community Medicine was then in the process of planning and constructing a new health clinic to address the significant health disparities found in Tulsa North. The Wayman Tisdale Specialty Health Center, built on a corner of the site of the Northland Shopping Center, has the potential to catalyze significant redevelopment and reinvestment in the area, and would become the focus of our planning area. OU-Tulsa President Clancy enthusiastically endorsed our choice. The Northland District was first developed in the 50s and 60s. The suburban neighborhoods are primarily small single-family homes from that era, with a few scattered apartment complexes mixed in, some of which are public housing. The shopping center and adjacent retail properties are underperforming or abandoned. Some are used by churches or faith-based social service providers. Not everything is gloomy, though. The district has wonderful views of downtown and the Osage Hills. It has an excellent access to the region's street and highway system, and is less than 10 minutes from almost all of the region's high-wage job centers. At the Urban Design Studio, we are committed to community-based participatory research, and we immediately began reaching out to stakeholders to partner with us. Eventually, we impaneled an 11-person steering committee from this group to guide the students and the planning effort. The students then devised a community involvement strategy with a series of meetings and events in the district to engage residents and property owners. They also created a wiki to allow people that could not attend the meetings stay informed and even modify the plan directly. The citizens' vision was translated by the students into a town center concept as described in the comprehensive plan. As seen here in this massing model, future development, shown in white, clustered around 36th Street North and Hartford Avenue. The students were careful to preserve and incorporate existing buildings, shown here in brown, by siting new structures on parking lots and vacant parcels. The surrounding residential neighborhoods would be improved, but their layouts and character left intact. The students applied many of the ecological city principles we have discussed earlier into the design of a district of moderate density with 3- and 4-story mixed-use buildings in a compact, walkable center. The streets are designed for people with wide sidewalks and narrow cartways. The citizens emphatically insisted on a large public space in the new town center. The resulting piazza would be the economic and social hub of Northland, surrounded by places to work, gather, worship, and play. The final plan was unveiled to the community at the North Star Neighborhood Block Party and presented to Mayor Bartlett by the students. Working from this starting point, the City Planning Department has subsequently completed the 36th Street North Corridor Plan, and it has been adopted by the Tulsa Metropolitan Planning Commission, with 2 other small area plans completed by the city. Tulsa voters approved $5 million for land acquisitions and improvements in the district as part of the Improve Our Tulsa bond election. Meanwhile, the city has allocated another $3 million for street and infrastructure improvements. A new community development company, Alfresco Development, has announced plans for a major mixed-use development across the street from the Northland Center, the first new private investment in the area in decades. and neighborhood leaders have initiated a branding and public relations campaign. The university completed and opened the Tisdale Clinic, which has been serving patients now for the last 3 years. As for us, our experience working with Northland and the School of Community Medicine has led to a continuing initiative called The Shed, or Community Health and Environmental Design Studio. The Shed's mission is to improve individual and public health through better design of buildings, neighborhoods, and cities. The Shed hosts several public education events each year and engages in a variety of research and community design activities. Well, that about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I've included a few links below if you'd like to learn more about the Urban Design Studio or The Shed. The Northland Wiki still works if you want to see how the plan was made. The last two are a couple of selected references I used when pulling together the research summary for public health and environmental issues. Please feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.